Okay, what is depth of field? This thing I keep mentioning. Well, I pulled up an official definition, which I loved. It's a noun. Believe it or not, it is a noun, even though it's three words. It's the range of distance in front of and behind an object focused by an optical instrument, such as a camera or microscope, within which other objects will also appear clear and sharply defined. Okay, blah, 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 blah. It all makes sense, but let's keep it simple. Depth of field is how much of a scene or a picture, the picture that you're making in your camera, from the camera to the farthest point away appears to be sharp and in focus. And in the photograph you can see in the background, this has very deep depth of field. Let's take a look at some more comparison. So deep depth of field, everything is in sharp focus from the closest to the farthest objects in the scene. And in this Edward Bertinsky, you see the sticks lying on the ground, sharp focus. This building or construction that's way, way out here, also in sharp focus. Everything from the foreground to the background. You might also notice, if you didn't, that's okay, but you might notice that this is a fairly wide angle lens. Now the one on the right by Albert Ringer-Pasch is shallow depth of field. So the only thing that is in focus is this branch that is in the front, this slice of the scene. Behind it, the trees behind are actually out of focus. This was likely taken with a much longer lens, and that accounts for both the shallow depth of field, but also the fact that these trees feel like they're really pressing up against the branch, whereas here, this feels like it's very, very far away. So what controls or changes depth of field? And notice I used that little that acronym because we often see that if you're reading in a photography book or anywhere. Depth of field will get shortened down to DOF. So what controls or changes it? There are actually four factors. The main one that I'm going to have you play with this week is aperture. That is the primary thing that changes your depth of field. And we'll get into these in detail. The second one, closely followed on aperture, is actually the focal length of the lens, which you've already seen a bit, that the wide angle tends to be deeper and the longer lenses tend to have a shallower depth of field. The distance from the subject. This is very, very important and often neglected, but how far away are you from the object that you're looking at, that you're focusing on? And the last one is the sensor or film size. And this is the great forgotten one. We'll talk about why. So let's start with aperture. The aperture, or the f-stop of a lens, is the primary factor that controls depth of field. So a very wide aperture, f1.8, will actually give you very shallow depth of field. A very small one, such as f22, is going to make a deeper depth of field. And then if you're in between at f8, it's going to be medium. So small apertures, f8 and up, will give you greater depth of field. As in this fabulous Ansel Adams, this is one of my favorite examples of depth of field in the whole world. And not just because it's technically well done, but because it's an example of why depth of field is so important to consider. He really looked at the scene and said, I want to be sure that the boulder that's on the ground in front of me is in focus. The boulders in the middle are in focus, the far boulders and the mountains and the cliffs. I want everything from the foreground to the background in focus. This actually was the goal of most of the photographs that Ansel Adams and his cohorts made, but it's really, I think, one of his most spectacular versions of that. Larger apertures, f5.6 and bigger, I say down, because remember, the smaller the number, the larger the aperture, they decrease the depth of field. So this photograph by the contemporary photographer Laurie Nix was actually taken in a studio with a little model. And notice that you have this very, very tiny slice of the scene. Just this and the tree and the front, that's the nose of the airplane in this little artificial scene are in focus. And actually a little bit before and everything behind is out of focus. So this is a very large aperture that decreases the depth of field. Now, when you're playing with aperture, you got to remember reciprocity. So I'm just going to show you yet another one of these charts. Whether or not this one works for you, it's fine if you need a different kind of visualization. But remember that If you are controlling your depth of field, that is, if you're changing your aperture to make your depth of field deeper or shallower, you got to change your shutter to compensate for that. That is known as reciprocity. So as you increase your depth of field, as you increase your depth of field, you may increase your motion blur. As you decrease your depth of field, you may minimize your motion or your movement blur. Oh, I hope that made sense because I'm not going back. Okay. So focal length, it's the next thing that affects the factor that affects depth of field. Now, there's a really technical reason why this is true. You don't need to worry about it. I just want you to trust me that a short focal length or a wide angle lens, something less than 50 millimeters, is going to naturally increase the depth of field. This is an Edward Bertinsky photo. It's definitely a wide angle lens. You can see how big the figures are in front and compared to the figures in the back. But notice the depth of field. Everybody here, crisp. Everybody back here, even all the way back to this back area, which appears very tiny, all very tightly focused. Now, the idea of tightly focused, there is actually a focus area, which is probably about here. There is it's what we call the appearance of tight focus that is really important with the focus. And I'll talk about that when I show you a couple more examples. A long focal length, 55 millimeters or longer, generally in your camera, is going to decrease the depth of field. So in this photograph by Sally Mann, again, you see this is a very, the focal length is very long. It's coming very close to the compressing everything. And the only thing that's in focus are just the front of this flower. The last thing is distance from subject. And this, or not the last, but the third thing that you can control is distance from subject. Often neglected. The farther away your camera is from the subject you focus on, the deeper the depth of field. Now, this is a fairly normal focal length that Jim Goldberg used, but he focused on a subject, the little girl on top of the trash pile, who was actually relatively far from him. So he was able to maintain this very tight depth of field from foreground to background. On the other hand, Marilyn Minter was very, very close to this subject, focused just on the drops on the glass in front of the lips. And so the lips are completely out of focus and the drops are in focus. Now, these are called circles of confusion. They're visible in this photograph, and these are pinpoints of light that are out of focus. That's actually what's happening when things go out of focus, is these individual points get so large that we see them as individual circles. And if there's not pinpoints of light, they just sort of mush together and we don't see the individual ones. This will always be in the shape of whatever kind of aperture you have. Oh, the last one. Oh, shoot. I totally blew this, but I'm not going back. The camera sensor or the sensor size. Ignore the text on here because it's not that important. But notice the cameras here. These all have different sensor sizes, and the sensor size dramatically affects your depth of field. However, you can't do anything about it because your sensor size in your camera is fixed. So it's not something we're going to worry about in this class, but it is a reason that you might notice that when you try to take pictures with your camera phone, it's very hard to get deep depth of field, and that is because your sensor is very small. The larger the sensor, the shallower the depth of field, the smaller the sensor, the deeper depth of field. Okay, sounds super technical. Don't let it scare you. Take some time. I'm going to walk you through it. And I think you'll be actually pretty comfortable with it. Here's a few more examples to inspire you. Shallow Depth of Field by Lee Friedlander. Notice he's focusing into the mirror, and so the frame of the mirror actually goes out of focus. Something really fun to play with if you're experimenting with depth of field. Gary Winogrand, wide angle lens. This street scene, he actually is managing to have very, very deep depth of field from the little girl in the foreground to the background. Martin Parr, very hilarious documentary photographer, captured this scene at the Tower of Pisa Really important that the Tower of Pisa and the figure in the foreground are all in focus. And this again, taken with a wide angle lens with a small aperture. Edward Bertinsky took this very dramatic picture of waste. And again, this is a wider angle lens and a smaller aperture. Some shallow depth of field. This is Thomas Allen, who I thought might be fun for you guys to look at in terms of having to photograph indoors. Super shallow depth of field. He got very close to his subject, wide open aperture. Keith Carter, same kind of thing. Very close, very wide aperture, probably a longer lens. Okay, I'm going to stop there, just short of 20 minutes. I want you to take a break, stretch, take the time you need, and then come back and watch the demo video.